The role of languages in bilingual settings is noteworthy given the purposeful attempts by teachers and children to use their unique multimodal and linguistic repertoire during classroom interactions and the instructional process. Language refers to the widely distributed human capacity to relate to others and to communicate ideas through a semiotic, meaning-making repertoire that includes linguistic features, words and sounds, and multimodal features, such as gestures and images. When these multimodal and linguistic features are seen as a continuum, teachers and pupils can draw from the various points of their development in order to make meaning and to use languages in and out of the classroom. The symbiotic relationship among languages and the linguistic and multimodal features that compose them are highlighted through the concept of translanguaging. Increasingly, researchers are focusing on studies on language use in bilingual and plurilingual settings to show the diversity of languages used in different contexts. Within the settings, translanguaging occurs in a variety of ways and for different purposes. Translanguage is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named and usually national and state languages. Thus, translanguaging has challenged conventional concepts where bilingualism and multilingualism are seen as simply the mastery of two or more languages from birth or as a result of an additive process. It is important that one acquires competence to communicate in different degrees without the need to become fully proficient in each of their named languages. The focus is on being able to use language and to make meaning, and speakers can draw and navigate through their full linguistic and multimodal repertoire to do language. By translanguaging, learners appropriate new languaging that builds on their own linguistic repertoire through the acts of being, knowing, and doing. For Grosjean, these processes of meaning-making are not clearly assignable to one code or another. While on the surface level, translanguaging and code switching may look and sound similar, social linguists who adhere to a translanguaging theory consider the bilingual speaker as drawing from a dynamic and fluid repertoire that's not compartmentalized into two separate named languages. They also define code switching as a term given to what is seen as changing named languages within one sentence or between two sentences. As in the current study, language is not simply seen as a set of structure or codes, but practices that are influenced by one's social interaction and context. The teacher's and pupils' use of language is seen from a translanguaging framework rather than a code switching perspective. Attention is focused on the internal perspectives of the speakers and their agency to select linguistic and multimodal features from their unique linguistic repertoire in order to make meaning of the content at their hands. As teachers see the potential of using their pupils' unique linguistic repertoire as resources and adapt to the instruction under clear principles, translanguaging also becomes a resource in the classroom. For that, the term translanguaging has also been described as a pedagogical approach. Garcia and Way affirmed that when translanguaging is used as a pedagogical tool, it keeps both senses of language visible, the external one, the named language, that is the meaning of instruction, and the internal one, the language repertoire of students. Whereas traditional pedagogy privileges the external named language, translanguage pedagogy privileges the internal language of learners. It does so by combining spaces and times where the named language is privileged and spaces and times where students are given freedom to express themselves using their entire language repertoire. As a pedagogical tool, translanguaging expands the zone of proximal development. As language is used in a meaningful way, new linguistic features can be added to a pupil's repertoire even though instruction is given through a language unfamiliar to him. This process is done through a well-known strategy, scaffolding. The scaffolding metaphor is widely used in educational contexts to refer to the support given to the learner so that learning becomes possible. The support is usually given by a more capable peer, and as in my research on 2015 on bilingual Indigenous children, young peers can use scaffolding strategies to help older peers and even their teachers. Another important aspect of scaffolding is that it is temporary, as once the skill is developed, the scaffold can be removed. In this study, translanguaging is not seen as a scaffold, that is, using one's first language to learn a second or third language. That is because populous languages are seen as a unique linguistic repertoire, and once a new named language is learned, it does not mean that the other language is taken away. Thus, the temporary aspect of scaffolding in itself is not applied to the concept of translanguaging. Translanguaging and scaffolding differ in the aspect that translanguaging is ever present in bilingual speakers' repertoire through the use of languages given his need to communicate, whereas scaffolding can be temporary and it involves the type of assisted teaching and learning that emphasizes interaction with peers and or teachers in moving learners from their existing level of performance to a level of independent performance. There are, for instance, scaffolding strategies that are used when translanguaging is seen as a pedagogical tool. When a speaker translanguages, this translanguaging does not act as a scaffold to simply cross over to the majority language and majority culture. Thus, even if speakers must recognize the power of named languages and their social-cultural constructs, they do not choose one language at the expense of other. Translanguaging as pedagogy focuses on building the agency of the learner through language in order to act and mean as a bilingual. It does not focus on exerting over students the power of named languages and the hierarchy they sustain. Although speakers are aware of these power hierarchies, they do language in a fluid and unitary manner, but drawing from their unique linguistic and multimodal repertoire, and they use language according to the context and their needs. Teachers and pupils use these scaffolding strategies in order to make meaning and to be understood, and use translanguaging in between to the same end. Where studies have explored the use of bilingual pedagogies within bilingual classroom settings, according to Baker and Lewis, their focus has been primarily on teachers' discourse. In this study, a stance is taken towards both teachers and pupils' translanguaging and scaffolding practices. As stated by Garcia and Wei, translanguaging refers to the flexibility of bilingual learners to take control of their own learning, to self-regulate when and how to language, depending on the context in which they are performing language. Lewis and colleagues differentiate this type of translanguaging, called pupil-directed translanguaging, from teacher-directed translanguaging, which involves planned and structured activity by the teacher and is related to translanguaging as a transformative pedagogy. So, pupil-directed translanguaging relates to the pupil's own use of their named languages, independently if translanguaging is elicited by the teacher or not. Teacher-directed translanguaging involves the instances where the teacher themselves translanguage, either for communicating or for delivering academic content. Nicola and Moore complement the distinction by defining different uses of translanguaging as orienting to language content or to the flow of interaction. They state that the former has an explicit language focus, often clarifying lexis or terminology important for the content area in question, to scaffold meaning negotiation and the teaching and learning of content. The latter refers to instances of translanguaging which are unmarked, geared towards the flow of interaction. And all of these types of translanguaging were taken into account during data analysis in the current study.